Chapter 10 gets into file handling and exception handling. So, we are going to be creating and using text files. We're also going to be creating and using JSON files. Uh, because we're going to be dealing with files, you are going to be introduced to exception handling in Python, which is similar to the try and catch exception handling in other languages. The terminology is a little bit different in Python, and we will be getting to that shortly. Uh, in this particular chapter, there are three main topics. And so for the videos, I've split them into three main sections. So we are going to be doing file handling, followed by exception handling, and then we're going to get into data storage, which deals with JSON files and how those are handled in Python. So we are going to begin with file handling. File handling basically involves either creating text or binary files, and we are going to be working with text files. Uh, they can make your programs more user-friendly because you can write user data to the file and then you can retrieve it. So you don't have to ask the user to re-enter data. You can also use it with games and web applications to save the current state of the application or game so that they can continue with it later. We are going to be reviewing the different functions for creating, reading, updating, and deleting files. So first, we're going to talk about how to open files. And with opening files, we're also going to talk about how to close them. And as I mentioned, the files can be text or binary. When you open a file, you need to tell Python how you are opening the file. Do you want to read it? Do you want to add data to the end? Do you want to create a brand new file? And this is referred to as the mode. And there are several different modes available. Most of them are just one letter. You will notice that some of them have a plus sign after. So what the plus sign does is in addition to doing whatever the mode is designed for, the plus sign also lets you read or write. So the R mode is for reading. However, if we add the plus sign to it, we can read and write. The append mode is for adding to the end, but if we add the plus sign, we can read and append. And same with write. The write, or the W mode, is for basically creating a new file. If the file exists, it will overwrite it. And W plus, in addition to creating the file, lets you read the file. X creates a brand new file, and if the file exists, it is going to return an error. So you're really only going to use the X the very first time you create a file, and I probably wouldn't use it. I would use either A or W because both of them will create the file if it doesn't exist too, and they're not going to throw you an error. The file type is text or binary, and text is the default, and read is the default. So if what you want to do is read a text file, you do not need to give it the mode and the file type. You basically just give it the file name that you want to open. And what it does is it stores the pointer to the file in a file variable. So the syntax for opening is pretty simple, right? It's whatever your file variable is going to be. You set that to the open file. And then you also need to close the file. So you take the file variable, which is a pointer to the file's location, and you call the close method. Now, if you use open all by itself, you do have to close the file. You have to use the close method. There is an alternate way of opening your files, and it's called WithOpen. And if you use WithOpen, the file will automatically close when the program is done. So that means that you don't have to use the close method because it's going to be automatically done for you. So the syntax for this is with open, you give it the file name, and if you do not want to read a text file, you also have to give it the mode and the file type. Okay, and then you say as file object. And again, that file object is storing the location of the file. And below that and indented are all of the statements that you want to execute that involve the particular file that you've opened. It is considered best practice to use with open because it is automatically closing the file. So a couple different ways of opening your files. As far as reading from the files, there's also a couple different ways to do that. So we have a read method where you've got the file open, and then you take that file object and you call the read method. And you can pass the file size, but that is optional. What it will do if you pass it the size is it'll kind of jump forward in the file. Otherwise, it starts at the beginning. And so that is whatever it reads in is stored in a data variable. And the data variable is something that you can print or process. So here's a little example where you've got a couple different foods in a text file. And we're going to read from the file and print it out. Okay, so here's our file. And the object we've created is called food file. That's the file object. So we use that food file object to call read. And we're going to start at the beginning of the file. And so it's going to read the whole thing. And it stores that in favorite foods. And then that is what we print out. And we get that content from our file. Because the results of a text file are automatically stored in a string object, you can call all of the string methods to help you format it. Okay, so we read from the file, it's stored in favorite foods. Python knows that's a string object, and so we can use upper, lower, title, or any of the other string methods on it. Okay, so if you have extra spaces in the file, you can use the various strip methods to remove them. Another method you can use to read from a file is called read lines. And read line stores each line of data that it retrieves in a list, and it adds /n to the end of every line. Okay, the only one it doesn't add the /n to is the very last one because that's the end of the file. So it is designed to read the entire contents of the file at one time and add that /n to each item in the list. Because read lines is storing the contents of the file in a list, you can use your different list processing methods on that data. So you can process it with a for in loop, for example. The output may look a little bit different than read because that new line has been added. Okay, so for example, you might end up with double spaced output. So here is an example or a syntax for how to use it. And then we've got an example. So we're taking our same food file and now we're reading in with read lines. So here is what it looks like. I'm just printing it as is so you can see it's printing out a list. And it did add the /n to each item except for the last one. Okay, then the next print is processing it in a for in loop. And that puts the output on each line. And then because this is in a list, we can sort it. We can call the sort method. We can call the reverse method. Okay, anything that you can do to a list, you can do to that list variable that you create. Okay, so again, this is read lines. So we have read lines, and we have read line. This is not plural. It's just no S at the end. This also creates a list, just like read lines with the S, but the difference is it only reads in one line, whereas read lines with the S reads the entire file. So if you use read line, you are just going to get the first line. So here's that same example with favorite foods. And now, because I'm using read line, I'm only getting one item in my list. Now, if you use WithOpen, it is automatically going to close the file. So here it's opened it. We've retrieved the one line. The file is closed. So if your intent is to read through the entire file, this is not a good method to use because you're only going to get one line. If you wanted to read through the file and you want to use read line, probably WithOpen is not the best way to open the file. You'd want to use just the regular open so that you could continue processing it. If for some reason you want to process one line at a time and you do not want to use read line or read lines or read, you can actually read one line at a time from the file using WithOpen, but we have to do a little bit different processing. So we're still using WithOpen, but we're reading the file using a for in loop. Okay, so instead of using a for in loop with a list, this time we are using a for in loop with the file object itself. Okay, and then whatever variable we create, whatever we call it, will contain the data that we're going to process. And this for in loop is going to continue reading from the file until it reaches the end of the file. So here is that same example. And you can see we have a for in loop. And so I'm printing out the line number using a simple counter. And then I'm printing out the line that was retrieved from the file. If for some reason you wanted to process the file one character at a time, you can do that too. So up here, we use the for in loop on the food file object, which is the file object. Down here, what we're doing is we're using read to read in the entire file. And then we're using the for in loop to process the variable, that file variable that we've created, one line at a time, or one character at a time. So here we have our WithOpen. We're using our file object to read in everything, and we're storing that. And then we're actually reading one character at a time and printing it. And you can see how that output looks. So what's the difference between this and the previous one? This one is using read to place everything into a variable. And this one up here, we are processing directly from the file object. So far, when we've been looking at our examples, we are assuming that the file and the program that is processing it are in the main directory. And by main directory, what I'm referring to is the folder that you have open in VS Code. That is your main directory. So if you have CIT228 open, that is going to be your main directory. And in a scenario like this, when we are saving our files into different folders, we actually have to tell Python the name of the folder and the name of the file. So if I pull this over here, I'm going to show you. So this is basically the exercise you are going to be working on down in hands-on 1. And you'll notice that I created a file name variable, and I'm telling it chapter 10 and the name of the file that I'm going to process. And that is because it's looking at the CIT228 folder. So from that location to get to this file, it has to open up the chapter 10 directory. Okay, so when we are talking about a path, if the file is not in the main directory, you have to tell it where that file is located. Okay, and that's what it's talking about as far as a file path goes. And once you do that, it won't have any problem processing your file. And because we're using the file name in several different locations typically, it is good practice to create a variable that is storing the path and the file name. And then you can simply use that variable in the open command. So that covers opening files and reading from files. We have a separate video for the hands-on, so we're going to move forward to writing to files. So writing to files is one way that you save data from your program. It is a permanent way of saving data as long as you don't delete your file or write over the top of it. So as I mentioned earlier, we've got a couple different modes that you can use to write to a file. We've got X, A, and W. X will create a brand new file. If the file exists, it is going to throw an error. A is appending, where it's going to add to the end. And if the file does not exist, it will create it. And write will basically write a new file. And if the file is there, it overwrites it. So it replaces it. The default is for a text file. But if you wanted to create a binary file, all you have to do is put a B after the X, A, or W. So writing to a file, you have to use the mode for writing. So in a program where you are going to read a file and you're going to write to the file, you actually have to have multiple open statements, which is why using WithOpen is so nice because it's closing the file for you. So if you open the file and you read from it, it will close it. And then you can write to the file or append to the file, and it will open it for write or append, and then it automatically closes. So you're going to open it with one of the write modes, and then you're going to use the file object to write to the file. And you're going to call the write method. And then in parentheses is the data that you want to write. And that can be a variable, or that can be any data that you want to send it. So here we have an example of characters.txt. We've opened it for write mode, and the file object is called cartoon file. And you'll see inside write, I'm grabbing input from the user, and that is going directly to file. Okay, so the next statement then is opening that same file, and the default is for reading. And you can see that I'm reading the file and I'm printing it. So who's your favorite cartoon character? Scooby-Doo, and it's printing that out. Then at this point, I do have the character.txt file. It does exist. And if I were to open it for writing and ask again, what is your favorite cartoon or cartoon character? At this point, it is going to overwrite. So I'm going to lose what was in the file, and it's going to basically create a brand new file over the top. So this little program, here's the outputs. You can see it started with Scooby-Doo. What's your favorite cartoon? Mickey Mouse Club. So then that is what I get. Okay, so you do want to be a little careful if you're using W. Just remember it overwrites the file. If you do not want to overwrite the file, if you want to actually add to the file, then you want to use append mode. So with append, we open it. This is opening for reading. How do I know? Because there is no mode specified. We are processing one line at a time. So if there are multiple lines, it will print out what's there. Then we're asking them for input. we're opening it with append, and then we're going to actually loop through and we're adding items to the end. Because we've used WithOpen, when this loop is done, it automatically closes the file. Okay, and here we are reading from the file again, processing line by line. And then here's some sample output. And you can kind of see a problem with the sample output. It did not split these into separate lines. So if you add multiple lines of text to a file, you actually have to include that new line character, or all it's going to do is combine all the data onto a single line. So here's my little revised program. And you can see that I'm opening it for write. And I'm getting that input, and now I'm storing it in a variable, and I'm adding the new line to the end. And then I'm writing that variable to file. Okay, so this is just going to give me 1. It's not in a loop. Then you can see that I'm reading from the file. Now I am appending, and I am in a loop so I can get multiple lines. And again, when I'm appending, I'm still grabbing their input, and then before I write to file, I'm adding the new line to the end. And then here I'm processing all the lines. And if you do it like that, then your data is going to be separate and it's not going to be all smashed together. Deleting files. So if you want to use create mode, you should verify that the file does not exist because if the file exists and you use create mode, which is the X, you're going to get an error. So there's a couple different ways that you can check to see if the file is there, but you do need to import OS because these are operating system methods. So there's 2 particular methods that are useful. One is called exists and the other one is called isFile. And so basically you've got operating system.path exists and you're sending it the file. And then you've got operating system path is file and you're sending it the file. And if either one of those are true, it means the file is there. Then you can call the remove method, which basically will delete the file. And if you do that, then using X mode, which is create mode, is not going to cause a problem. Okay, so if you want to use create mode, you have to open the file using X, and then you can simply write your data to the file. So here's a full example where I am checking to see if characters.txt exists. And if it does, I'm removing it. So I'm deleting it. That way I can use my create mode to create a brand new file. And just to show you that this works, I'm going to go ahead and run it for you. And I will pull this over because I do have character.txt created. So if we look in my chapter 10 folder, you can see I've got character.txt here. The nice thing about a text file is you can actually open it and see who's in there. So I do know that it exists. And I do need to tell it that it is chapter 10 directory. So I'm going to add here. And then we'll replace this. So everywhere I put that file name, I'm going to replace it with the variable storing my file, which is a better way to do it. All right, so let's go ahead and run this. What is your favorite fictional character? All right, now we'll quit. And now if I look at my file, okay, my old list is gone and I just have the new one. And that pretty much covers file handling for text files. You know how to open them, you know how to close them, you know how to read from them, you know how to add to them, and you know how to delete them.